This episode is sponsored by PAX, the gold standard in emergency response bags. So when you're working under pressure, you need kit to be both dependable, tough and intuitive, and that's exactly what you get with PAX. Every bag is handcrafted by expert tailors who understand the demands of post-op care, from the high-tech, skin-friendly and environmentally responsible materials to the cutting-edge welding process that reduces seams and makes cleaning easier. PAX absolutely puts performance first. They've partnered with 3M to make perfect reflective surfaces for better visibility, and bright grey interior makes finding kit effortless and fast even in low light. With over 200 designs, PAX bags are made to suit your role, your needs and your environment. And thanks to their modular system, many bags work seamlessly together no matter the setup. PAX doesn't chase trends, their designs stay consistent, so once you know one, you know them all. And if your bag ever takes a beating, their in-house repair team will bring it back to life. PAX are built to perform, made to last. Learn more at pax.bags.com or head to the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, we're going to do a two-part series on grief. So in the first of these episodes, we're really going to just look at grief from a theory perspective, but our guest is really going to unpack her journey through grief and how it relates to her indeed job role and perspectives. So whether it's supporting families after a sudden loss, or indeed witnessing first-hand trauma, or coping with personal emotional impacts, grief is really an ever-present companion in post-op care. So joining us is Liz Gleeson. She is a highly respected psychotherapist, educator and grief specialist. Liz is the creator of the internationally acclaimed Shapes of Grief podcast and training program as well. So she lectures widely on grief and loss, and she's got a background in somatic therapies and a PhD in progress on forest therapy and bereavement. So Liz brings a compassionate, embodied and deeply informed perspective to the conversation. So within the conversation, we're going to just touch on some of the key models and theories of grief. We're going to look at the Kübler-Ross 5 stages of grief, dual process model, attachment theory and the continuing bonds theory. But we're also going to look at the art of listening, cultural competence, caregiver compassion and burnout, but also the ethical challenges in grief support. So without further ado, Liz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Owen. It's great to be here.
It's fantastic to have you, actually. Just before we dive in, actually, to theories, could I just get you to maybe unpack, Liz, why it's so important that we engage with grief?
I think traditionally grief has been such a taboo subject, Owen, and it's something that we want to get over, move away from, have people bounce back to how they were beforehand. But nothing could be farther from the truth when it comes to the actual lived experience. Grief is something that we will all encounter professionally and personally. It's a subject that's just relevant to everybody to varying degrees. Some of us need a basic grief literacy and others need a real professional competence. There's nobody who doesn't need this information.
Yeah, absolutely true, absolutely true. And to your point, actually, Liz, grief has touched my life. Fundamentally, as within post-op care, you engage with grief on a very in-person level, but it also touched my life on a personal level. And absolutely to your point, I think being informed about it ahead of time is extremely important. Can we just dive in actually, and it's going to be quite a wide-ranging conversation, so we'll go at some pace, but I would like just to cover off a few of the maybe more fundamental or well-known stages or models of grief. And maybe initially, if I could get you to just give us an overview of the Kübler-Ross 5 stages of grief, and also maybe how, if you see this model maybe falls short in some which way for patients and families, or if you could just speak to the model and how it plays out.
Yeah, sure. Well, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross did amazing work in the area of dying and death. She actually developed these stages for people who were dying. That when they learned that they had a terminal illness, they went through different emotions, including denial and bargaining and anger, but not necessarily all of them and not in any prescriptive way. And then some other person decided this was applicable to grief, but actually it is not a theory that we use at all. There's absolutely zero evidence for stages model of grieving. It suggests that grief is linear, that we have different emotions to go through and then we're done. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we know that nothing could be further from the truth. So stages model is outdated. There's no evidence for it. And it's a myth, which is perpetuated in literature and Hollywood. But actually, it has no place in contemporary grief theories.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and we'll put links to the model. But you're right, absolutely, it's outdated, and maybe let's just move on and look at some of the more relevant models. Actually, could I get you to really unpack or just walk us through the dual process model of grief, and indeed how maybe that helps us better understand the fluctuating nature of grief?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to just give some context to this. Grief and grieving are two different things. So, grief is an emotion or a cluster of emotions um, that we feel throughout our lives from the beginning we're born to the moment we die. Every time we have a loss, there will be an element of grief that surfaces for us. The grieving process, however, is a much more complex process that we go through, usually after a significant loss. And it's a process of, I suppose, accepting the reality of the death, which can take a long time. This is Warden's process, and or Warden's model. I'm going to just start with this one and then come back to the dual process. Warden's model suggests that we need to first accept the reality of the loss. This can take 6, 12, 18 months, and it's a neurological process that we go through where we are remapping the world without our deceased loved one. So knowing that they've died and actually fully accepting that this is real, this is a new reality, are two separate processes, okay? Once we accept the reality of a loss, we're much more likely to feel the pain of grief. So if we're in denial or protesting the reality of the loss, it's kind of kicking grief or the pain of grief down the road. Warden suggests that we also then have to adapt to life without the deceased and get used to a world that they no longer exist in physically. And then eventually, at some stage, we begin to reinvest in life. We begin to go, oh, you know what? I might book that holiday. I might join the gym this year. We start to find meaning and purpose again in the world. But these are not stages, and they're in no particular order, and not everybody goes through them. But more or less, that's an umbrella for the grieving process, if you like. And I think it's really quite accurate. Within that, then, grieving, so feeling the pain of grief, this is where the dual process model can come in. When we are grieving, we are not in a perpetual state of loss and deep grief. We oscillate in and out of it. So we might be feeling the pain of loss, be very much in loss orientation, in the depths of despair. And then an hour later or a couple of hours later, we might be addressing our bills, organizing a funeral, making dinner because the kids still need to be fed. So we're not so in the loss orientation, we're more trying to restore in restoration. Restoration is not easy. It's not a break from grief. It also involves quite an amount of labor to keep pushing forward. But dual process essentially means that we are facing our loss, feeling the pain of grief, and then we're pushing forward, making the dinner, maybe organizing to see somebody on Friday, and then we're back in loss, and then we're back in restoration. So it's this oscillation back and forth between loss orientation and restoration orientation, which helps us to integrate the loss. So, you see someone at the coffee machine laughing and their father died last week. They're laughing in this minute, but in another half an hour, they may be under the heavy burden of loss. And it's really important for us to know that we're in and out of it all the time. We feel we can really cope and we're dealing quite well one minute, and the next minute we can be on our knees. So that's what the dual process is highlighting, this process of grieving in and out of loss and restoration.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And to your point, Liz, it can be really elusive just to see that potted almost moment of a person and think, gosh, they're having fun or they're laughing, and actually you're right, it's not the bigger picture, and it's not necessarily the longevity of their experience. You're seeing them in that moment, and absolutely, it is to your point, oscillation, and it absolutely on my fundamental journey was the same, and actually coming to a place of acceptance, but actually feeling guilty that I would be enjoying myself initially, or that from a terrible place of loss, really. Let's move on and look at attachment theory, Liz, if that's okay, and just how attachment theory informs our understanding of sudden loss.
Yeah, sure. I mean, attachment is fundamental to understanding grief responses. Um, the people that we were more attached to were likely to have a much bigger severance or feel a much bigger severance when they die. Um, I mean, our whole system is built to attach. It's how the species survives. And essentially, grief is a protest to being removed from that person that we're attached to. So, this is another deep biological and neurological process that is going on under the surface. Um, Bowlby and Parks actually first recognized attachment and its relation to grief when they were working with bereaved parents. And they noticed that often the responses of bereaved parents to their deceased loved one was like a young child. If you can imagine a young 2-year-old suddenly being removed from their parent, the distress is immense. And that is attachment theory, playing out in front of our eyes. And it doesn't matter if we're 40 or 80 or 60, if we're attached to somebody and they die, it is like an amputation. Some part of us has been removed, and somebody that we love dearly has been removed. And our initial response to that is to protest, to cry, to grieve, to demand their return in a way. And it's only when we fully accept the reality of the loss that protest behavior begins to abate, and we start to grieve more, if you like. But we do know, from my clinical practice, people who are really securely attached and who have internalized a lot of love tend to fare a little bit better than those people who struggle, who've, more insecure attachment styles. Um, we can think, oh, they weren't very close to their parents, so they must be okay. But actually, that's not always the case. We can really struggle with abandonment and regret and remorse, if that attachment bond has been not the best or not the most secure or not the most loving. So attachment plays a huge role in how we understand an individual's response to loss. It tells us what this person meant to them.
So just before we sort of pan away or indeed pan out of some of the theories, Liz, could I just we'll just finally touch on continuing bonds theory, and indeed how it might give caregivers or indeed paramedics the sort of the ongoing connections in their interactions with bereaved families. Could I get you to just maybe explore and indeed unpack continuing bonds theory?
Yeah. One of the biggest fears of bereaved people is that everybody will forget their loved one, that people will stop saying their name. Um, they want them to continue to exist in some shape or form. It's interesting, actually, Freud talked about, when someone we love dies, we need to mourn them, and then we need to break the attachment and reattach to someone or something else. And then his daughter died, and he realized the last thing I want to do is move on or get over my beloved daughter, Sophie. I want to keep her close to my heart at all times, forevermore. And this is what many bereaved people want. I'm not going to say everyone, because it's not true for everyone. But for many people, we want to maintain a relationship, maintain a closeness, but in a different form. So for the individual, they need to figure out what form that's going to take for them. And for those of us who are supporting those individuals, we need to not be scared of saying their name, of asking about them. Sure, they might cry, but generally the relief from being allowed, from being given permission to talk about their deceased loved ones is really, really important. A lot of us avoid that because we think, oh, but what if they cry? What if I upset upset them. They're already upset. They're already crying, but probably in isolation. And you, by opening up that conversation and saying their name, you're inviting them to have their grief witnessed and have their love witnessed.
Listen, that's powerful. And we mentioned this on a different podcast. And again, not to bring my own personal grief journey into this too much, but I can identify with that massively. Liz, let's just look at something which I continually try and do throughout podcasting, but just in life, which is really the art of listening and that intentionality of listening to absolutely to every word, but to the tonality, to the intonation, to the meaning behind the communication. Could I get you to really just explore and unpack for us the art of listening in these moments of acute grief?
Yeah, and it's so much about just being fully present, isn't it? Like literally putting our own experience, our own feelings to the side. I think a lot of us make the mistake of feeling like we need to make it better, or we need to have something clever to say, or we need to have a solution, or we need to be able to offer advice. But all that serves in doing is shutting the person down. I had a supervisor once who used to say, show up and shut up. And, there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of wisdom in that. Can we just show up, bear their grief alongside them? I would say it's not just passive listening. It's not just being there and saying nothing. Sometimes it's extending a hand onto a back. It's fully showing up with the intention of empathizing, of trying to understand what this is like for this person, and also with compassion, which is a desire to alleviate their suffering, not fix it, but simply showing up, bearing witness, showing them that their grief isn't too much for you. That is compassion, because that alleviates suffering, that eases suffering rather than exacerbates it. The minute we try to fix, advise, or come up with solutions, or, yeah, I know how you feel. My auntie died. And, the minute we bring ourselves in, we've ceased to show up fully for that other person. There is nothing like the gift of actually leaning forward and being fully present to someone in that moment.
And a bit of a personal question, actually, Liz, but just could I get you to speak to an example, really, where you sort of the art of listening in your world, because you run podcasts, you training programs, you've done a PhD, and all that requires very intentional listening.
It's a good question. And I think it's always different. And it's different for different situations. If someone has just experienced a profound loss, for example, a loved one has just died by suicide, and they're sitting there and they're being tended to, the way I'm going to show up for that person is very physical. It's very physical. Their body's in immense distress. Their prefrontal cortex is shut down. They're in survival mode. I'm going to show up with my calm presence, with my steady body, with my eyes, with my breath, with maybe my hand on their back. I'm going to acknowledge this is really, really difficult. And I'm probably going to offer them a little bit of hope. I know you're going to survive this. Because in that moment, they're wondering, how will I ever survive this? I'm going to offer them just a little bit of hope. You will survive this. I know this doesn't feel like it now. Trust me, you will survive this. We've got you. So it's almost existential holding at that point, and it's very physical. I'm not going to drown them out with words or reflecting back anything, because the chances are their body is just like a hare caught in the headlights of a car about to knock them down. So my quality of presence and the way I listen in that moment is going to be very different to how I might listen 6 months down the line. Where their prefrontal cortex is starting to come back online, and they're trying to make sense or make meaning of things. Then the quality of how I listen will be maybe quite different. Tell me more about that. What did they mean to you? Who was he? How was that for you? That sounds really difficult. So it's still very much all about their process. 18 months, 2 years down the line, it might be quite different again, where there might be a lot more psychoeducation or, reflecting back or really diving into how their ongoing understanding of loss and grief might be inhibiting them from adjusting to the world again. So there isn't just one answer to that question, Owen. It's reading the situation, what is needed right now, and knowing that what is needed in 2 days might be quite different, and what's needed in a week might be different again. There is nothing worse than the people who've done active listening courses and they're putting that in practice, because that's telling me that they are just trying to pull out their tools and do the right thing, as opposed to just sitting there and showing up fully with their body. It's not about us when we're showing up for someone else. So all the time we're reading this particular situation, what is needed right now, not what did I learn in that course
Yeah, no,
6 months
absolutely.
ago.
No, listen, absolutely. And to your point, actually, I realized in the acute stages of grief, you said this around the prefrontal cortex, actually, they can barely remember their own name. And actually, it's so visceral and it just is so emotive and takes over their whole body. Actually, you're right, just presencing, just being present, but also not giving them complex information or indeed maybe even any information they can't assimilate, can't process, but just you're right, being there, getting them to sit down, maybe a cup of tea, and like you said, just physically that physical presence as well, and you're right because I think absolutely there's no cognition, there's no conscious cognition because it's just overwhelming.
We do need to acknowledge what's happened. Like, this is devastating. This is devastating. I'm so sorry this has happened. So we need to acknowledge what's happened, and we need to validate their emotional response. Of course you're feeling this way. Of course you're feeling this way. We have support and help for this down the line. Right now, you just need to breathe. Right now, you just need to get to your next breath, and then your next breath.
Absolutely, and absolutely, and the time horizon really narrows. And a guest said this actually on a different podcast was around, especially with either pediatric death or acute illness. It's 10 minute slots. It's like I'll tell you what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and the time horizon narrows. But just it's maybe all they can process is the next 10 minutes, the next 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Um, Liz, let's pivot slightly and look at exposure because the one of the aspects of grief is that if there is continual exposure for paramedics or pre-hospital staff, the highly emotive situations on a daily and or weekly basis, one of the things I struggled with really as a critical care paramedic was the exposure to grief on a daily basis and very different facets and types of grief, but grief nonetheless. Could I get you to really just unpack just that, how we avoid or indeed navigate burnout or indeed those emotional boundaries when there's a high frequency of exposure to grief?
Hmm. And you know what? I think those emotional boundaries might be the problem. Paramedics are human. We are moved, and it's okay to be moved. Um, my understanding from burnout is it's not working too hard or using your body too much. It's not being able to complete emotional cycles. So you go into a difficult situation, you have an emotional response, and then boof, I have to put in a professional boundary. And where does that emotion go to? Now, I spoke with a beautiful man during the summer. He's a paramedic, a firefighter. And he told me about, a really difficult situation that he was in with his colleagues. And he said they came out, and at the back of his van, his colleague was bent over, holding the back of the van, crying and talking about what he had just witnessed and gone through. He's the least likely to experience burnout because he's allowing the emotion move through him. He's expressing it. He's talking about it. That was tough. He's completing the emotional cycle. I think we need to create space for that. There is no such thing. it's a concept, it's a construct of we need to keep these boundaries and keep it together. I am moved to tears at times, sometimes when I'm with people and they're telling a deeply moving encounter as something that's happened to them, their loved ones. And I actually think it can be really useful for the client to see the loss and the grief reflected in somebody's eyes. But I'm really clear that the emotion that's being moved in me is because of their story and their experience and my empathy and compassion. It's not because of my stuff that's unprocessed. There's a huge difference there. So I think, to answer your question in two simple parts, we need to know our own shit, if I could use that expression. We need to understand our own grief, and we need to deal with that somewhere else that's not in the workplace, so that when we are being moved, it's not our stuff that's being moved. We are genuinely being moved by somebody else's experience because we are human. And that is a biological, neurological response that we have. Our mirror neurons are activated when we see somebody in intense distress, and we can feel it as if it's our own. That is normal, that is natural. And as long as the emotion is fully connected with the present experience and not our past experience that are unresolved, I think we're okay to be moved. And I think that avoids burnout.
Listen, I would agree actually, and I think processing or indeed engaging with emotion is absolutely not a bad thing, either in the moment or, I counseling myself, and actually I found that hugely beneficial just from a pulling the plug and letting the emotion, just having someone witness. You said this before, but someone else bearing witness to my emotional journey or indeed grief exposure and just stories, me being able to tell stories actually and get that out was felt really good actually. And but just trying to process it actually with somebody else. um Liz, just talking about compassion fatigue for a moment, it's certainly something I had to navigate a lot of and just re-engage, because to your point, being a human first and being a clinician second, I think is probably one of the most powerful pivots actually. And it's because it's something people can relate to. We're all human, and actually not hiding behind cold facade really. Could I get you to really just maybe unpack compassion fatigue, some of the early signs of compassion fatigue that you've seen within your journey, indeed clients or otherwise, and indeed how we should engage with that, because there is, as you were saying, sometimes these protective elements that clinicians put in so they don't have to engage with highly emotive situations. But in the other, you go too far on that spectrum and you become a stone cold castle against any kind of emotion, and you start to really embody this compassion fatigue.
Hmm. There's a lot here, Owen, and I think it's more to do burnout and compassion fatigue. It's more to do with systems. It's more to do with broken systems, not having the resources, not having the staff, not having the space. So I work in private practice. I have time, I have space, I have weeks on end if people wish to show up with them and for them. I don't suffer from compassion fatigue. It's not a difficult thing to open your heart, and let compassion flow. It's necessary. It's part of our humanity. I think the minute we begin to feel cynical, or cold, something's going on there, but it's usually more to do with a system that we're working under that's not giving us the right resources to be able to do our job in an adequate or appropriate way.
So let's just pivot slightly, Liz, and look at some of the ethical considerations really around providing grief support in the field. Indeed, when time and information are limited, I think one of the main tensions unseen in the pre-hospital world is that there is always another call, there's always another patient to get to. But we've spoken about this in other places on the podcast around actually just not you're not on the clock. You're being a human first, and actually removing the time element just for an element of time so that you can just be there and, to your point, presence, be present in the moment. But could I get you to sort of speak to, because an element of this is maybe signposting to the GP or otherwise when you can't be there. Certainly in my practice, it was around getting other community, so other family members or close friends to be with the patient's family, so the deceased's family, so that they weren't either on their own after we left, or indeed once the police left, there was just a semblance of community there. Could I get you to speak to sort of the ethical considerations really around just feeling guilty, I guess, and removing yourself from what is a highly emotive situation and a profound life experience?
And you can feel the emotion of that. Like, is there, there's so many people I've supported who've been in that room, with paramedics. There's a few there's many ethical considerations to consider here. Number one, again, is on the professional's perspective. Do your own grief work, understand your own losses so that you're not bringing that into the room, so that you're able to be fully present. Are you trained? Have you done a basic grief literacy training? Like, we know that every single bereaved person needs a certain level of input. They need, everybody needs acknowledgement of the loss, validation of their emotions, maybe some information, some signposting, as you said, about where they can go with this. And they need community, compassion, love and support, kindness. Does everybody know that that's important? I'm not sure. Does everybody get that memo that they're the basic levels, And I think when we don't know that, are we more likely to exacerbate things by, well, I don't know what to do here. I've never been trained to deal with this, so I'm going to walk out because I don't want to make it worse. But actually, the walking out and not acknowledging can make it worse, right? I hear time and time again as a grief therapist, that paramedic looked at me and gave me a hug, and it was everything. They couldn't have been kinder. He sat and made me a cup of tea. She put her arm around my shoulders. Like, what would we want in that situation? Probably those people are no different. Can we be human and kind and just give them those basic things, But then also, who do we signpost to? Am I aware of what to look for? In certain situations, for example, if there's been a suicide or a sudden accident or a child has died, do I know that people who've been bereaved under those circumstances probably need a different level of care? They need more than just acknowledgement, validation, compassion, and psychoeducation. They probably need something else. They need other supports. Am I aware of where to signpost to? This level 2, if the basic level is level 1, and I'm talking about the adult bereavement care pyramid here, from the Irish Hospice Foundation. So if level 1 support is needed by everyone, it makes sense that everyone attending these situations needs level 1 training. Then we also need to understand there's level 2 and there's level 3 and there's level 4. Am I aware of the people who need those other levels? And am I aware where to signpost to? Or if I'm offering level 2 support, do I know what that is, who needs it, and what training I need to provide that? So in answer to your question, training. Everyone needs at least level 1 grief training, and many of us need level 2 and level 3 and level 4 also.
Yeah, indeed. And actually, to your point, Liz, we'll signpost to your podcast, but also to your website, because these tools and training and indeed educational courses can be found on your website. And absolutely there should be, to your point, a foundation of level 1 understanding, and then certain practitioners can build level 2, level 3, and level 4, and actually we'll signpost there because it'd be great for listeners to be able to go away and just do a deep dive into the different levels of training. And I completely and entirely agree. Looking at so moving through, Liz, just as we've got 3 more questions left, one would be really around true to say, in Ireland, certainly in Dublin and the hubs and London and other places where there is really a religious and cultural and diverse population and indeed expression of grief, without unintentionally, to your point, imposing your own values. Could I get you to speak to really how we sort of open the lens up to different expressions of grief? London was such a great training ground for me, because it is such a melting pot and it is so diverse. No two grief journeys or indeed expressions of grief amongst different cultures were the same. And it was every time I was learning, actually, but it was profoundly different. Could I get you to kind of really just unpack that?
Yeah, and cultural competence is really, really important everywhere. I think we all need it everywhere. But also, humans are humans, you know. And what I've seen is people scared to offer appropriate support to people of a different culture because they're afraid of getting it wrong. So withholding support. So if somebody is there and they look different to me, or they're from a different race or different background, am I going to withhold that care because I'm afraid of getting it wrong? You know, at the end of the day, that attachment is true for every culture. That grief, that loss, that devastation is true for every culture. And kindness and compassion are nearly always welcomed, you know. So we should always be asking permission. May I put my hand on your back, or can I sit beside you, or is it appropriate for me to offer you a cup of tea right now? We just need to feel into it. But I would say always move towards rather than away from. It's impossible for each of us to know all the different cultural implications. But if we are working with different cultures, it's important we understand. I spoke with a midwife once she's here in the National Maternity Hospital in Dublin, who talked about a Romanian family whose child was going to die before or shortly after birth. And in this particular culture, their tradition was to not see the baby, to not hold the baby, to not name the baby, and just to allow that to happen without engagement. And it was very, very difficult for the Irish midwives to do that, because it was against their culture, and there was one member of the family who was kind of straddling both cultures because she had lived in Ireland for a long time. And she was very torn between her traditional culture and the new way she was learning of doing things in Ireland. Is there a right or wrong? No, it's just what we're used to and what we're led to believe is right. But these Irish midwives, for them, they needed to hold that baby until the baby died. They took turns holding the baby. They gave the baby a name. And so they dealt with it in their way, while the family dealt with it in their different way. It's really important that we don't impose what we know. So even my training is very much based on Western culture and Western grief theories. I'm always very sensitive to go, I delivered it, or I offered it to the Ukrainians when war broke out, but I didn't know if it was culturally sensitive or appropriate. So I actually asked 4 Ukrainian psychologists, will you please take a look at this training? Tell me if it's useful. Tell me if it feels appropriate. And if it is, I'll make it available in Ukrainian free of charge. The same goes now for Palestine, but I'm not sure that my training is at all culturally relevant or culturally appropriate. So I would never go in there going, here, you can have this. It needs to be monitored first. It needs to be assessed. And it may not be at all what's culturally relevant there or what's needed, Yeah, it's this partly this white savior complex also. So that there's so much to be unpacked. It's really impossible in a couple of sentences. And I also don't want to say something that's wrong or offensive, or it's not an area that I've done a huge amount of research in. So I don't want to be saying things that may be just not true. But I think that's really important, to be humble and to know that there's so much more that we don't know than what we actually do know. And so it's up to us to fact find, ask questions, but for God's sake, don't leave somebody on their own getting substandard care and no kindness or compassion because of their culture. Find
Yeah,
out what's needed and get in there,
yeah, absolutely,
or
absolutely. And
find someone who can.
yeah, absolutely, Liz. Absolutely. And to your point, it's about moving towards people, even if you're unsure how that might look. It's leaning in and for sure asking permission before you put an arm around someone. But it's leaning into their situation and moving towards them and understanding that they just what their immediate needs might be. And it might be as simple as a community or a cup of tea or just to sit down and indeed yeah, just bring things back to that simple level. But there is a lot of complexity behind it. But there's the general principle is lean in rather than lean out. Absolutely.
Yeah, and with autonomy, like respecting the autonomy of the person who's bereaved, also, we should do that with everybody we're with. Don't assume we're wanted. Don't assume we can just march in there and offer our support. It's to check in with this person. Am I welcome? Am I wanted? Am I needed?
Just as we finish off on this conversation for this week, could I get you just to really unpack, just I guess in a way, one principle that you really would kind of wish from a wish list, really see embodied within emergency responders and or frontline staff around grief. You mentioned the level one training, and I think that's a powerful reminder that there is just a baseline of competence and understanding fundamentally around grief and around immediate needs. But could I get you to speak to sort of just one thing that you wish or would hope that frontline providers would understand about grief?
Your humanity is more important than your professionalism in that moment. Of course, act professional at all times, but bring your humanity out. Um, all of society is a social construct. We've built these, I'm the professional, you're the bereaved, you're the client. Like at the end of the day, when someone has been ripped from us, it's visceral, it's physical, it's existential, it's the world has changed in an instant. The ground has gone from beneath our feet. Gosh, just show up, be human, be kind, bear witness. Because it really, really makes a difference. And I suppose something that your listeners mightn't hear a lot, but that I hear all the time, 6 months later, 12 months later, 3 years later, they remember you because they're in such a state of hypervigilance when an accident has happened or a trauma has happened or something highly distressful has just happened or someone we love has died. We remember the faces of the people that were there. We never forget them. We remember the people who walk out. We remember the people who shed a tear and put their arms around us. We remember the person who stayed and made a cup of tea. We remember someone who took 30 seconds to sit down beside us and say, I'm really sorry this has happened to your son or your husband, to your family. I will think of you.
That's to be kept front of mind, I think, because only then can we start to build relationship and rapport and actually start to, like you said, make a difference. Um, because, like you said, they'll remember that moment for the rest of their lives. And so that interaction is human first, clinician second, and it's extremely important.
How we interact with people will either ease their grief or exacerbate it. And I think to be the ones who ease it, we need to be grief trained. We need bag loads of humanity in this profession. And we need to have dealt with our own stuff so that we are truly able to show up for other people. So they would be my 3 top tips.
Listen, thank you. Thank you, Liz. Listen, we'll see you next time on the podcast. And it's just been really powerful just having you on. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Owen.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.